Welcome, everyone, to Discover Top 5, the home of gripping stories that bring the untold, the hidden, and the most shocking parts of the world into focus. Whether it's the most stunning natural wonders, untold histories, or, as we explore today, the darkest secrets lurking behind the curtain of global power, our mission is to uncover the stories that you won't hear anywhere else. And today, we're taking a hard, unflinching look at an issue that casts a long shadow across every corner of the world: corruption. From global corporations to governments and military regimes, this insidious force continues to shape lives, governments, and future generations. It transcends borders, religions, and cultures, infiltrating every facet of society and crippling the very institutions that are supposed to protect us. As the saying goes, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In the nations we're about to explore, corruption runs deep. It impacts not only the lives of everyday people, but also festers in the very roots of society, strangling the economy, stalling progress, and perpetuating injustice. This is a fight against an unseen enemy, an enemy that remains protected by those in power, growing stronger with each passing day. Today, we uncover the top 10 most corrupt nations of 2025, and the truth might shock you. From governments that overlook the will of the people to oppressive leaders that treat citizens as expendable resources, each country on this list is a testament to how corruption eats away at the soul of a nation. But these are not mere statistics. These are the stories of countless lives affected by betrayal, greed, and a thirst for power at any cost. For every dollar that is embezzled, for every law that is ignored, and for every human right that is trampled upon, innocent citizens struggle in silence, their voices unheard amidst the cracks of political and economic ruin. The victims. Families torn apart, economies in shambles, and the vulnerable cast aside. The perpetrators. A dangerous, elite few who manipulate the system for their own gain, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation and inequality. In this deeply eye-opening journey, we don't just recount the facts. We dive headfirst into the underbelly of international corruption and examine how these governments exploit their power to protect their interests and why, in many ways, this systemic corruption will continue to thrive unless we demand action and accountability.
What does corruption really mean on the ground? How does it destroy the lives of ordinary citizens? How does it bend and break entire systems, forcing people to fight for justice in a game rigged from the start? Stay tuned, because we're about to take a deep dive into a global crisis that, despite being well-known, has failed to receive the attention and urgency it deserves. Through this journey, we'll examine the state of these nations, how corruption penetrates every level of government, economy, and even culture itself. This is a harsh wake-up call to the state of the world in 2025, and trust us, by the end of this countdown, you'll see the world in a completely different light. So get ready as we pull back the curtain on power, politics, and the poverty that profits from it. Grab your seat, because we're diving deep into corruption like never before. This is Discover Top 5, where we reveal the world's most shocking, untold, and eye-opening truths. Let's uncover the most corrupt nations of 2025. Let's begin the countdown. Have you ever wondered what happens when a country lacks a functional government for decades? Welcome to Somalia, the world's poster child for entrenched corruption, ranked at the bottom of transparency indices for years. Somalia's governance is crippled by lawlessness, clan-based politics, and insurgent groups such as Al-Shabaab that thrive on bribery and extortion. With an estimated GDP of only $7.7 billion in 2024, Somalia suffers from a dire lack of public resources. Yet billions in international aid mysteriously vanish before reaching those in need. Transparency International's most recent report reveals that over 70% of Somali citizens admit to paying bribes for essential services like education and healthcare. The judiciary fares no better, with justice often carrying a hefty price tag, favoring the wealthy and connected. Meanwhile, the lack of a centralized banking system facilitates rampant money laundering. Somalia is a hotspot for illicit financial flows, with billions siphoned annually. Yet amidst the chaos, there is hope. Grassroots organizations and international NGOs persist in their fight to empower communities and demand accountability. Somalia remains an emblem of resilience despite its challenges. How does corruption flourish amidst the wreckage of war? Syria provides a tragic answer. Years of civil conflict have created fertile ground for embezzlement, bribery, and systemic abuse. Once a thriving nation, Syria now grapples with unimaginable hardship, as survival often depends on bribing the right officials. Under the Assad regime, corruption has become deeply institutionalized. Billions in humanitarian aid intended for Syria have been misappropriated to benefit those in power. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens struggle with an unemployment rate exceeding 50% and inflation that has surged over 120% since 2020. Public servants, earning meager wages, resort to bribes simply to subsist, perpetuating the corruption cycle. From oil smuggling operations to fraudulent reconstruction contracts, Syria's war economy flourishes, benefiting high-ranking officials and warlords. The country's burgeoning Captagon trafficking industry generates an estimated $5 billion annually, overshadowing international sanctions. Despite these dire conditions, Syrians continue to endure and resist. Their struggle underscores the resilience of humanity in the face of unimaginable adversity. South Sudan, a nation born with hope in 2011, quickly became a cautionary tale of corruption and conflict. Despite possessing one of the largest oil reserves in sub-Saharan Africa, the world's youngest country remains one of its poorest. Over 75% of South Sudan's population survives on less than $1.90 a day. Oil accounts for nearly 95% of the national budget, yet its revenues are shrouded in mystery. Billions have disappeared into the pockets of political elites. A 2024 UN report estimated that $4 billion had been embezzled since South Sudan's independence, funds that could have built schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Corruption is not limited to finances. Food aid meant for starving citizens often ends up on the black market, and public sector jobs are frequently awarded along ethnic lines. The government's opaque military spending further siphons critical resources. Despite these setbacks, grassroots movements are pushing for transparency, driven by the dream of a brighter future for South Sudan. Venezuela, home to the world's largest proven oil reserves, has become a tragic example of economic mismanagement and corruption. Once one of Latin America's wealthiest nations, its economy has contracted by more than 75% since 2013, with inflation soaring to 400% in 2024. Petróleos de Venezuela (PDVSA), the state-owned oil company, has lost an estimated $11 billion in revenue over the past decade to fraudulent contracts and theft. Corruption here exacts a devastating human toll, with over 90% of the population living in poverty. Essential goods like food, water, and medicine are scarce and often require bribes to obtain. The CLAP program, intended to alleviate hunger, has been repurposed as a tool for political loyalty, with aid diverted to black markets. Despite these bleak conditions, Venezuelans have displayed immense courage in demanding change, fighting for a future where resources benefit the many rather than a select few. Once known as Arabia Felix for its prosperity, Yemen now stands as one of the world's most corrupt and war-torn nations. Years of civil war since 2014 have plunged the country into despair, with corruption flourishing amidst the chaos. Over 80% of Yemen's 30 million citizens rely on international aid, yet a significant portion of this aid disappears or is misused. In 2024 alone, an estimated 30% of aid intended for Yemen was diverted to armed groups or sold on the black market. The result? Families desperate for food, medicine, and fuel are left to fend for themselves in an increasingly dire situation. Local officials inflate public payrolls with ghost employees to pocket wages, while smuggling networks profit from Yemen's shortages. Despite international efforts, systemic corruption hinders the nation's recovery, making Yemen one of the most tragic examples of governance failure. In North Korea, corruption is a cornerstone of survival. The country's tightly controlled system masks exploitation and greed that benefit the ruling elite at the expense of ordinary citizens. The shadow economy, dominated by the Donja, North Korea's nouveau riche, thrives on illicit trade, arms deals, and cybercrime, generating billions annually. In 2024, North Korea was linked to over $1.5 billion in cryptocurrency thefts, likely funding its nuclear weapons program. Everyday survival hinges on bribery, as citizens pay officials for food, medicine, or basic travel permits. International sanctions, while isolating the regime, failed to curb its sophisticated smuggling networks and offshore financial activities. The plight of the North Korean people is compounded by the regime's secrecy, leaving little room for accountability or reform. Despite international condemnation, corruption remains entrenched, perpetuating the regime's authoritarian grip. Haiti, the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere, is a heartbreaking story of poverty and corruption. With a GDP per capita of just $800 in 2024, resources are limited, yet embezzlement, ghost projects, and bribery are pervasive. The Petro-Carib Fund, meant for development projects, saw over $2 billion misappropriated, resulting in deteriorating infrastructure, power outages, and underfunded healthcare. Gangs control entire neighborhoods, often in collusion with corrupt politicians, leaving citizens with little hope of safety or prosperity. Despite international aid, transparency remains elusive. The fight for accountability is led by grassroots movements demanding a future free from corruption's suffocating grip. Equatorial Guinea is a stark contrast of riches and poverty. Despite vast oil reserves and a GDP per capita of over $8,000, over 75% of its citizens live on less than $2 a day. President Teodoro Obiangema's administration has been marred by scandals, with billions in oil revenues diverted to luxury purchases for elites. Basic services such as education and healthcare are grossly underfunded, and citizens struggle for access to necessities. Suppression of dissent stifles efforts for reform, ensuring inequality persists. Equatorial Guinea's story is a sobering testament to how resource wealth can deepen corruption rather than alleviate poverty. One of the world's poorest nations, Burundi battles corruption that cripples development. Over 70% of its citizens live below the poverty line, and systemic corruption impacts every aspect of daily life. Public funds for health and education are frequently embezzled, depriving millions of essential services. Political patronage and favoritism dominate the government, with bribes often determining outcomes in the judiciary. Despite international donors supporting over half the nation's budget, meaningful reforms are scarce. Grassroots organizations continue fighting for accountability, but Burundi's path to recovery remains steep. Secrecy and authoritarianism define Turkmenistan, a nation with immense natural gas reserves yet immense poverty. Under President Serdar Berdimuhamedov's rule, corruption is systemic, with billions in gas revenues disappearing.
As the final segment unfolds, we shift from intense scenes of corruption, surreptitious government deals, injustice and legal systems, citizens in despair to uplifting images of communities coming together, rallies where voices are heard, peaceful protests led by individuals demanding transparency, and the hopeful faces of changemakers who refuse to back down. These visuals slowly transition into scenes from different corners of the world: volunteers cleaning up after protests, groups working together to expose corrupt officials, and young people advocating for a brighter future. And just like that, we come to the end of our deep dive into one of the most urgent and unspoken issues in our world: corruption. From the streets where injustice is felt every day to the office rooms where critical decisions are made by corrupt officials, we've seen a harsh reality today, a reality that millions of people around the world are still enduring. Corruption isn't just a shadow in government offices. It's in the homes of families struggling to survive, the schools failing to educate, and the legal systems that, instead of protecting the people, serve to protect the interests of a few. But despite all this, we cannot afford to fall into hopelessness. We cannot, as individuals, afford to ignore the responsibility each of us bears in holding the powerful accountable. Though these nations and the regimes we've discussed seem so far away, the truth is, corruption has a ripple effect. What happens in one corner of the world impacts us all, and with that realization comes a challenge and, perhaps, an opportunity to stand tall and say enough is enough. It's easy to feel like a single voice can't possibly bring down empires of corruption after all. History tells us that such systems often seem indestructible, that those in charge are far too powerful, too well-funded, too shielded to ever fall. But that's the illusion of power that they've crafted. The reality is, they rely on our ignorance, our indifference, and our silence. But every story we share, every voice that is raised in defiance, every person who chooses to fight for their freedom and dignity, that is how change begins. The people in the nations we've highlighted today, the courageous activists, journalists, and citizens who risk everything to stand against corrupt systems, remind us of the true power that lies within us. The power to seek justice, to demand equality, and to stand in solidarity with those who need it the most. And remember, no fight for change is too small. Every act of bravery, every person who refuses to remain silent, is a part of dismantling the foundation that keeps these corrupt systems standing.
The task ahead is monumental. Change doesn't happen overnight, and certainly not without resistance. But it's in the toughest moments that resilience is forged, and we can't ignore that through every storm of corruption, there's always a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark of change that refuses to die out. It's not a distant dream, but a very real possibility that can begin today with you. Before we wrap up, take a moment to consider, what is your role in combating corruption? How can you be an advocate for integrity in your own life? Whether it's voting in elections, speaking up against injustice, demanding transparency, or standing in solidarity with marginalized communities, there are countless ways you can make a difference. Every single action counts. You don't need to be a politician, an activist, or even a powerful public figure to bring about change. Sometimes the simplest of acts asking questions, shining a light on unfair practices, and advocating for a better system can create the foundation for an uprising of conscience. And so, as we bring this video to a close, remember this: every one of us has a responsibility. We each have the potential to help dismantle corruption from the grassroots level up to the highest positions of power. Because in the end, it's not just the corrupt regimes and individuals who stand to lose. It's us, the people, your neighbors, your community, and the next generation who ultimately bear the brunt of their actions. Thank you truly for watching, for engaging, and for sticking through this critical exploration. We hope today's video gave you not only a closer look at some of the world's most corrupt nations, but also some powerful tools for thought. But this doesn't end here. It is just the beginning. Make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to discover Top 5 for more eye-opening dives into critical issues that need our attention. Let's continue pushing the conversation forward, talking about the difficult truths that challenge us, and making sure that we're all part of the solution, not just silent bystanders. As always, we invite you to reflect on what we've uncovered here today, share your thoughts in the comments below, and talk to others about what we can do together to address corruption on a global scale. The world doesn't change with a whisper, it changes with a roar. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep pushing for answers, and as always, stay inspired, stay informed, and stand for justice wherever you are. Thank you for watching Discover Top 5. See you next time.